Hey, how's it going guys? My name is Dom, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you one of my preferred ways to toggle CSS transitions or animations using JavaScript. To put it simply, this technique involves using JavaScript to toggle classes which then are going to enable transitions or animations. So this is going to prevent the use of inline styling, and it keeps your code organized. Now before jumping into the code, I just want to mention for anyone who may have missed my last few videos, I'm now uploading courses to Udemy. So I'll leave a link to it in the description down below. My most recent course is a JavaScript DOM crash course, which is perfect for JavaScript beginners who would like to learn the JavaScript DOM. But now let's jump into the code for this video. Alright, so let's take a look at the examples being covered in today's video. So we have two different things going on here. The top one is going to be the ability to hide this square. So this one here is going to be using CSS transitions to hide or toggle the visibility of this square. And we're going to be enabling this transition using JavaScript when the button gets clicked on. A similar situation down below, but this one here is a pulse of this circle, and this is done using a CSS animation, once again enabled using JavaScript when clicking on the pulse circle button. So the whole point of these two examples here is that the top one uses transition and the bottom one uses animation. So you're able to see how we can toggle both of these different types of CSS properties, transition or animation, using JavaScript. And it's also worth mentioning that you're not limited to hiding an element or pulsing an element. You can add whatever CSS properties you would like to essentially create a transition on any property you would like, not just these two right here. So going inside this tab right here, we're going to be starting off the code in today's video with this HTML. So we're going to be starting off like this. I'll leave a link to this code in the description down below so you can easily pick up from where I'm starting. All right, so the starting code is going to look like this. Nothing too fancy going on. I've simply got both divs right here in the HTML with their respective square and circle classes. And the same thing goes for the buttons here. We have btn hide square and btn pulse circle. All right. I'm also getting a reference to all of those elements down below in the JavaScript, so you guys can simply pause the video right now and copy this code, or you can download it from the description below. And we've also got up at the top here in the CSS, we have some simple properties on both of these classes here, a width and a height and a background for those two there, but of course a border radius on the circle to actually make it a circle, and also a display of inline block to ensure that for stylistic purposes, the button is going to be displayed on the right side of each. So, like I said, nothing too fancy going on here. I would assume that if you're currently working on a website or a project, you've got a similar situation set up where you have some HTML elements that you would like to apply some transitions or animations to. All right, so enough talking. Let's get into the code to make this work. All right, so once again, going back in the browser, just to reconfirm here, we're going to be working on this top section where if I click on the button, we're going to want it to fade away. So let's go inside the CSS here. The very first step is going to be to enable the fade away transition on the square class. Okay, so let's drop down here. We're going to be saying a transition property here of opacity at 0.5 seconds. So this right here is simply saying, look, this square is going to take 0.5 seconds to change the opacity property if it actually gets changed. So if I was to change the opacity on the square, I want it to take 0.5 seconds. Okay, I'm sure most of you know about this transition property already, so I won't go into too much detail there, but that's basically what it's going to do. Now, the way this solution here is going to work is we're going to be toggling some CSS classes on the elements down below. So we're going to be doing this using JavaScript, and this right here is going to avoid inline CSS styles. Okay, so let's make a second class here underneath the square called hidden. Okay, so now with this hidden class, this acts like a modifier, which says basically any element with the class of hidden, we want it to fade away. So right here, we're going to say opacity, and then change this to be 0. So now, like I just mentioned, any element with this class is going to have a 0 opacity. Now, in the case of a square, it's going to take 0.5 seconds to change that opacity. So now it's going to be as simple as toggling this class using JavaScript. Let's go back in the actual HTML here, or in the browser. Let's refresh the page here, then inspect the square and simply add the class of hidden using the Chrome DevTools. Press enter and it's going to fade away. If I was to remove the hidden class now, and you can see here it comes back. So we're going to basically use JavaScript to toggle that class. So going back inside the text editor, down in the JavaScript, we're going to now say btn hide square, so the button to hide the square, .add event listener. We're going to say when this button gets clicked on, we're going to simply run this function, which is then going to toggle that class. We can say square.classList.toggle and then pass through here the class of hidden. So now when clicking on the button, we're going to toggle that hidden class. Let's go back in the browser here, refresh, click on the square, and we can see it's going to fade away. Click it again and it comes back. So of course we're using the class list property here. We have access to many other properties on the class list, such as add and also remove. So if you want to just make it so when you click on the button adds the hidden class, let's try this one now. Go back in the browser, refresh, click on the add, and now it's going to make it hidden. Click it again and it's not going to go away. So that's what toggle is doing there. It's basically just a shorthand for saying if it's there already, then remove it. If it's not there, then add it. So let's put toggle back just like that. And that is our first example done. Now it's important to understand that, technically you can apply this hidden class to any element in your page. But the problem is, if it doesn't have, or if that element doesn't have the transition property, then it's not going to fade away. It's going to simply change the opacity. Let's say, for example, I don't include transition. Save this, go back in the browser, refresh, click on the button. It goes away straight away. So that transition right there is giving us the fade effect. So a way to get around this would be to apply the transition property to every single class that you think is going to be faded away, or you can have a dedicated class to make something support a fade. So as an example, let's drop down here. We can make a new class called supports hidden, just like that. And we can just simply add that CSS property to this class. So now any element, so for example, the square, I can say supports hidden, and now the same effect is going to happen, but it's a bit more modular in that I can also say that the circle supports hidden and it's going to work in the exact same way. So now both of them are going to have that fade away effect. Okay, let's just real quick for example's sake, I'll just add the class of hidden to the circle and it's going to fade away. So I recommend this way of doing it with the supports hidden class because you're going to reduce the amount of code that is, duplicated. So you have less duplicate code with this solution right here. You could also just call this supports fade. It's up to you guys, but that's a solution right there. Now, moving on to the second part of this video, of course, the circle and the pulse animation. So when it comes to this one, the very first step is going to be to define some keyframes for the animation itself. So in order to pulse the circle, we can say down here, keyframes or at keyframes. Then we can just say pulse as the keyframe name. Then dropping down here, we can just say, look, at 0% of the animation, we're going to have the opacity at 1 and the transform at scale at 1. So these right here are simply your defaults. So by default, the circle has an opacity of 1 and a scale of 1. Then we're saying at 50% of the animation, we're going to simply copy these two properties here. We're going to make the opacity 0.5 and the scale at something like 1.25. All right. Then we can just do the exact same thing down below for 100% of the animation and put the opacity back to 1 and the scale also back to 1. This right here is our keyframes definition. We can now add it to any element which we want to pulse. As an example, let's add the animation property here to the circle, and we're going to say pulse at 0.5 seconds, ease in, ease out as the timing function. And then we can also just say infinite. That way it's always going to run infinitely. Let's save this, go back in the browser, refresh here, and we have this pulse on the circle. Now I might have used a different scale on the first example. So let's just fix that real quick. So it's going to be a scale of 0.75 instead. That should do the job. But basically we have something like this. The circle is always pulsing. Now it's going to be the exact same situation, guys. So in order to toggle that pulse and not make it happen all the time, we can simply add the class of pulse to our CSS and add the animation. So arguably, this right here is actually a little simpler because you don't need to have the supports hidden property as the example with the transition. So simply adding the animation property to this class here, we can now toggle the pulse class on the element itself in the JavaScript. So down below, we can say, okay, cool. Copy this code here. We can say btn pulse circle. When you click on the pulse circle button, we're going to say circle.classList.toggle and toggle that pulse class. Save this, go back in the browser, refresh, click on it, and it's going to pulse. Click it again and it goes away. So that right there is both of those examples complete. But the main points to sort of take away from today's video is that by using CSS classes to enable your transitions, it's going to avoid the usage of inline styles, which could get messy if you have too many of them. It also means that all of your stylistic related code remains in your CSS. That way you can only change the CSS files to change the styles of your page as opposed to relying on the JavaScript in the event that you want to change your transition. So the JavaScript is purely there to add or remove the classes from the elements in which you want to toggle the transition or an animation for. And that is all for today's video, guys. Hope you enjoyed this one and you learned something. If you did, make sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.